Welcome back to Science Corner. I'm excited to have Blake Ebersole with us today. Blake Ebersole is a supplement insider who's privy to a lot of the little secrets behind supplements. From research to ingredients, quality control, and even FDA regulations, he's worked with and consulted for the small startups all the way to those huge multinationals we've all heard about. Blake, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jordan, and it's great to be here with you today.
Awesome, man. So you hear the word quality. I hear the word quality a lot too, especially when it comes to supplements. I feel like it often gets reduced to a checkbox. GMP. Oh, it's been third-party tested. Good. All good to go, compliant. When you hear a brand say that they prioritize quality, what does that word actually mean to someone like you?
Well, the supplement industry, especially here in the U.S., is really crazy, and we got 200,000 products on the market, and more than 10,000 brands and manufacturers. And quality is one of those words where it means a lot of different things to different people. And kind of like the word sustainability, or we can think of some of these kind of other throwaway words. There's not really a standard behind it, but there's the word quality really to me means absolutely nothing at this point, because everybody uses it. And, being on the back end and knowing how the sausage is made, I've really seen that. It's really, there's a gradient or a spectrum of quality practices. And so, the way I think about it is, quality is like an onion with 1,000 layers. You break through the first layer and you got to get to the second. And then eventually you get to the core. And by then you've shed a few tears already because you've seen how things really work. And so, how I really look at it from a quality perspective is, how do you sort through these 1,000 layers? And, I look at it in terms of a, checklist, and, surgeons and airplane mechanics, they have their checklist because they don't want to forget that one critical thing that can make the whole operation come down. And so, I've broken it down to, there's at least 1,000 check boxes on our checklist. There's 300 check boxes under GMPs, which is good manufacturing practices that all the manufacturers must have. And then, on the label, when I review labels, make sure they're compliant, there's 100 check boxes on that too, even down to, the thickness of the lines in the supplement facts panel. And all, a lot of this stuff is very prescriptive in the FDA regulations, but, it's not commonly enforced. So a lot of companies, they don't know what the thickness of the hairline or of the thick line is supposed to be in between the essential nutrients and the non-essential nutrients. And so you see it, the supplement facts panel on the label is supposed to be very standardized, but you end up seeing it, a lot of different ways. I've 200 check boxes on my ingredient specifications sometimes. Especially botanicals are getting into all these different controls, and supplier qualification. How do we know that a supplier is good and they're giving us good ingredients? Well, there's dang near 150 check boxes on that. And so really, when you break it down, there's a lot there. And so, I kind of put supplement quality in kind of 4 different buckets. And the first bucket is brands that are maybe trying to do the right thing but don't really understand. They're buying small quantities from a manufacturer. They're just trying to sell product. It might be, it's a common Amazon seller type of situation. So they might only have, say, 50 boxes checked out of their 1,000. And the second bucket is more like companies who are pretty much 80-20 FDA compliant. Manufacturer passes FDA audit, but they're not testing all their ingredients maybe the right way. They don't know what a ingredient specification is supposed to look like. And so, you can tell kind of, where a company is based on their label and their website, who their manufacturer is. The third tier is kind of like, the established brands, and they know what they're doing. They're passing the FDA audits, but they don't have everything perfect. They don't have the institutional knowledge necessarily. They're relying on, outside consultants for a lot of their work. And then, the final tier are like the 1%ers, Amway Nutrilite, who basically invented the supplement business. They got systems, and they're testing everything for pesticides, and they know that certain raw materials have certain problems, and they're doing it at such scale that if they screw up, well, that's a big risk for them. And so that's kind of how I look at it, on the spectrum of quality, obviously.
Awesome. So I mean, it's crazy, right, to just hear that and then think about this like checkbox that normally like happens. We think, oh, quality. So, but if we look across the full life cycle of a supplement, I mean, sourcing to shelf, where do you often see like quality break down the most? Even if good intentions are all above board, like where do you typically see these issues happen most often?
Well, what a lot of consumers, or most consumers, don't understand is that there's a supply chain involved between, the ingredient supplier to maybe the ingredient distributor to maybe then the contract manufacturer who's hired by the brand. And so there's this kind of wall of opacity between each of these links where, the supplier only wants to meet the quality requirements of their customer. And then that link only wants to meet the quality requirements of their customer. So if the brand doesn't know what they're doing, or they don't know the quality requirements, what they should be, well, that passes all the way back down. And oftentimes when I work with startup brands, like they want to know price and turnaround time, but they're not looking at any of this other stuff. And so, the most common breakdowns are the things that FDA has cited in their audits and warning letters for many years, and that's specifications, and then it's identity. So specification tells you what an ingredient or finished product is supposed to look like. How are you supposed to test it? How do you identify the ingredients and make sure that selenium isn't sawdust, right? And so, sometimes the supplier makes a mistake, or, there's certain things going on there. And so there has to be this redundancy of checks throughout the system that is controlled by the specifications. And, everybody, often has a specification, but the challenge is in kind of an error of omission type of thing, where you might see a very short specification. And so, well, what's missing on that spec? Well, it could be very important things that you don't want to overlook. And so it's not necessarily what's on the specification, but it's what's missing. And so, a lot of brand owners and contract manufacturers don't know what's supposed to be on a specification for, say, green tea extract, and what the standards should be, because they're not green tea extract experts, and nobody can be an expert in every single ingredient. And, I'm still learning myself after 20 years. But, even ID testing, it's next to specifications, the most important part, but there's ways to fudge it, right? So buyers could use their supplier's ID test as their own without verifying it themselves. They could use an ID method that doesn't capture all of the possible adulterants in a sufficient way so that it passes when it actually shouldn't. And we see this with botanicals, which are, complex mixtures. And so, again, the supplier only wants to share the information that will sell their product, and they don't want to overshare and hurt their sale, because this is a business, right? And so you see a lot of kind of fudging of ID testing, and then you send it to a third-party lab. Well, a third-party lab might not be doing the right thing either necessarily, and a lot of companies send the same sample out to multiple labs and then pick the one that passes their product. And there's no control against that happening either. So there's lots of games that can be played by unscrupulous companies who they're simply trying to get the lowest costs for their products so that they can maximize their margin. But at the same time, if you don't have that quality control there, you don't have people who really understand this stuff. Well, it might be innocent, like you're not deliberately trying to fool anybody, but the way the system is set up, you're just looking for the lowest cost product.
Oh man, that's super. So that's really interesting, especially that part about like sending to multiple labs and kind of seeing what happens and what comes back. You also brought up botanicals there, and you spend a lot of time, I know, working with botanicals and natural ingredients. From what I understand, botanicals tend to expose a lot more quality problems faster than standardized single molecule ingredients. Can you talk a little bit about why that happens and why botanicals are a little bit maybe even more risky than some of the others?
Yeah, so you remember, most people remember from high school chemistry what a compound is, and that's a single molecule. And so vitamin C and magnesium glycinate, these are all single molecules. And so botanicals, on the other hand, are mixtures of thousands of or tens of thousands of molecules or compounds. And so one metaphor I have for it is like, okay, you can control your kids, your one or two kids at home, but imagine being a principal at school and trying to control 1,000 kids, and they're beating each other up or they disappear. It's like, how do you control 1,000 versus one or two? And so it really is that essence of what is in the botanical, and what are the markers, what are the key markers we want to measure, so that we know that we have the same strength time after time. And what are the impurities? Where are the bad apples in this thing that we want to minimize and meet regulations? And so that's why, our specifications for botanicals are often, 3 or 4 times longer than something for vitamin C. I talk to, friends who work in pharma, and their quality, they're quality assurance experts in pharma, and I blow their mind with what I have to deal with in botanical ingredients. They're like, they suddenly have a new respect for what we do here.
Wow, that's interesting. So if botanicals, like when an ingredient fails a quality check as a botanical, like we hear the term, like people love to throw around the term like adulteration, and it was like malicious and all. How often is it truly like actually being adulterated versus like maybe something is just breaking down the process, or maybe there's some incorrect assumptions about what that ingredient actually is supposed to do?
That's right. Well, adulteration is another thing that's there's many different types of it. And the most common type is what we call economically motivated adulteration, which is most times it's just diluting something that's supposed to be stronger, and diluting it, because then your cost is lower and you can sell it at the same price. And so it's kind of a profit padding thing. And so we see this with non-standardized botanicals, what we call ratio extracts, 5 to 1 or 10 to 1. Well, there's no way to verify whether an extract is a 5 to 1 or a 10 to 1. And so that's why we want these standardized where we're measuring, the actual markers. And so, but again, it's like most of it is not going to hurt anybody. It's they're adding starch or something like that. And it's very difficult to detect starch, being added. There's not many chemical tests if you're adding 10% or 20% starch on the top. Another thing, when you're spray drying a liquid extract into a powder, oftentimes in order to keep it from clumping and sticking to each other, you have to add some kind of starch or maltodextrin during the process. And so either they might put 20% maltodextrin on the spec when it's actually 80%, or they might not list it at all. So, there's supposed to be an ingredient disclosure on the specifications of everything that's added to it. But, sometimes they might add it, but they might not specify how much. And so ultimately the consumer isn't getting the strength or the potency of the ingredient that they think. And it's really, it's hurtful to the consumer because they don't experience the benefit that, is expected from this product. And then, obviously the worst kind of adulteration is the kind that can hurt the consumer. And so, the most common one that we see is really not deliberate. It's a mistake of the system. So it's not the fault of one person. It's when we have an undeclared allergen. So, allergen controls are so critical, even in what we're talking about too, where everything has to be labeled with milk or soy or whatever. But hey, let's say that the guy who's supposed to be putting the right label on the product, they mess up the label, or they pick the wrong label. Well, suddenly you're in a situation where you can kill someone. So, there are, there's lots of different types of adulteration. There's been so much written about this. American Botanical Council has a great set of documents, and this information is out there for people that want to find it and look for it. Especially now with AI and ChatGPT, I mean, you can pretty much have it write your report of every type of adulteration on a particular ingredient, whereas before, it might have taken weeks for somebody to sort through it.
Awesome. One of the things I see, as we talk a little bit about botanicals, one of the things I see associated with botanicals a lot is the word natural. So natural is one of the most common, but I think also one of the most loaded terms in the world of supplements. And so from a quality perspective, how do you personally define natural, and where do you think that concept works or does not work within our industry?
Yeah, similar to the word quality, it means different things to different people, and it's such a complicated topic that FDA, has done a lot of work, and they still can't figure it out because, again, there's different grades, like, magnesium glycinate. Well, the magnesium is natural, the glycine is natural, but the process that bonds these two molecules together to make magglycinate is not natural. So then you say, okay, well, what type of process is it? Is it a simple cooking or acidifying or drying process that's been around, since humans discovered fire? Is that natural? Because you say, hey, we've been dehydrating and grinding and everything for 40, 50,000 years at least. Well, is that a natural process, or is that man-made, quote unquote? So, if you say, okay, well, volcanoes cook rock, well, so cooking is a natural process. Dehydration, the sun dehydrates, everything we see in the sun. And so yeah, you get into all this like kind of really philosophical and existential discussion about, what is nature, and how do we produce and feed people and keep people healthy with our ingredients if we're relying totally on things that have no human impact at all, right? Another example is, carrageenan from seaweed. Well, totally natural. It's the same molecule found in seaweed. It's extracted, from seaweed to purify it. Well, so many people are afraid of it because it's got this big long name and they can't pronounce it. So yeah, it's a loaded question, but it requires some amount of like, a little bit of background of scientific understanding, relying on your high school chemistry class, and not listening to these crazy, the people that are just trying to sell you, a book or a podcast or whatever. You really have to think about, okay, well, ultimately for me, it comes down to safety. Like, okay, is it safe at the dose that we're using, in the people and the use occasion, like a toxicologist would look at it rather than like a podcaster would.
Awesome. Well, a lot of the things that you kind of described there remind, like, they all are types of like what seem like processing, right? And there's this common belief in the space that less processing is always better. It's not processed, unprocessed, less product, et cetera. In your experience, when does processing really help preserve quality, and when does it start to actually undermine the quality of a supplement itself?
Yeah, that's a great question because, we have this idea of processing is bad kind of baked into our psyche by now, but people forget that one of the purposes of processing is to make stuff safe, to make our food safe. That's our number one goal in food development is, we don't want to hurt anybody or kill anybody. Well, number one, because we're people that care, and number two, because it's business liability and you don't want to get sued. And so, like, nobody's trying to hurt anybody. And so, but we need to be honest that process is like cooking and acidifying and drying and milling into powder. These have been around forever, like I said. And so, it swings so far the other way now that we're seeing more food poisoning and recalls as a result, because, one example is, the greens powders, and nobody wants their greens powders to be brownish. But chlorophyll, which is the green molecule, is relatively unstable. You heat it too much, and then it turns brown and it breaks down. And so people want their bright green powder to look like their salad or something, right? And so, but as a result, you're sacrificing food safety principles where, if salmonella is already, on the greens, or in some cases it's inside the seed, it's an endophyte that then grows and can multiply on the plant. And then you're taking, for example, sprouts, which are young plants. They're moist and wet for their whole life. They don't have to go through natural drying periods of wheat in the field or whatever. Well, you can't just put that stuff and air dry it, because that doesn't kill the salmonella. But on the other hand, you don't want to heat it too much, because then then the customer won't buy it, the consumer won't buy it because it's brown. So we have to realize all these trade-offs that are involved, that exist, underneath when we want things, minimally processed.
So is based, that's interesting. Is it based on that, is it safe to say that a brown greens powder would actually be better for us than the green version?
Well, that's where supplier qualification comes in, and having a food safety expert to go in and say, hey, if it is bright green, let's look more closely at your food safety practices. Let's look at your salmonella testing and your sampling and everything like that. Because, pathogens are very, very difficult to detect. Like, you can take a sample out of one drum and it tests negative, but then the next drum over, is going to be hot. So we have hot spots. And then we have ingredient suppliers don't always, like, they might sell ingredients from different farms, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so the end user, the manufacturer, the brand doesn't know that. They think, oh, the supplier has the same thing every time from the same place. But that's not the case. And so, yeah, it might have been, passing for years and years, but then the supplier bought from a different farm that they didn't properly qualify and didn't go to the nines. But yeah, the salmonella problem in greens is like, it's a Pandora's box almost, because it takes so much effort to ensure that salmonella is not in it, that, it becomes cost prohibitive. And then obviously you have the buyers who want, the competitive price, that don't want to pay for the auditor to go and audit the whole thing, or pay for a consultant. And so, yeah, the economics impact it. The increased demand stretches out the supply. And so now we have to buy from suppliers that maybe we haven't visited yet, and things like that. So whenever an ingredient spikes in demand, we always see quality problems, because we don't want to say no to business, right? We're gonna make it happen. We're gonna ship, but we're gonna take shortcuts on the quality process.
Oh man, so that's super interesting. I want to tug on that thread a little bit more. So let's assume we're starting with really high quality materials, and greens powders, I think, is a good example here. But what can actually still go wrong during that manufacturing process that I think people that maybe are consuming these products on a regular basis don't appreciate or understand what's happening behind the scenes?
Yeah, I think, well, so there's two general stages, and one is what's happening on the farm level, the drying, and then the farm doesn't have the grinding or the milling themselves, so then that has to go to the miller, and hopefully the miller's close by. It doesn't have to be shipped raw material overseas or whatever, but sometimes that's right. And then it gets to the finished product manufacturer, who's blending it and putting it in jars. So things can go wrong at each one of these stages, but in my experience, it usually happens on the farm level, and then there's not good controls later on in the process to detect that, and because it's cost prohibitive or whatever. And so you're looking at everybody's responsible, and ultimately what many brand owners don't realize is that they are ultimately responsible, because their name is on the label. So when FDA comes knocking on your door, they're not going to knock on the door of the manufacturer. They're going to put the brand's name on the warning letter, and then your name will be associated with FDA in perpetuity. And so, so many people think, oh yeah, my manufacturer has it all under control. Well, oftentimes they don't, because your manufacturer has 200 other customers and you're just one of them. And so yeah, there's this, we want to trust people. We want to trust people who seem like they're doing a good job and everything, but the verification isn't there. And so, but yeah, stuff can happen at every point in the process. And things like salmonella, like, again, you can sample it, the manufacturer might sample it and it tests negative, but then suddenly, we have food poisoning going on. So.
And so throughout this whole process, one of the last things that tends to happen is what we see a lot of is third-party tested. And third-party tested is often treated as this gold standard for quality. Talk about third-party tested, where it falls short, how much does lab choice and even the testing methodology matter throughout this process?
Yeah, it matters. It's everything, right? Because if the lab screws up, then, you could kill someone. And so, even choosing the lab is important. And, labs are businesses too. They're not, we shouldn't place, ultimate trust in their word too. Sometimes they screw up, or sometimes the method didn't work, or for whatever reason that day, the machine wasn't working right. Sometimes labs are jamming samples through so fast they're not running controls in between to make sure that the column isn't clogged, or so part of the overhead and the cost of lab testing is in all of the controls and the labor and having experienced staff. But oftentimes companies are choosing the cheapest lab. And so, we saw this in cannabis where you get an HPLC for $50. It's like, you can't even, you can't run that, they're not running controls if it only costs $50. And so somebody on the brand or the manufacturer and has to understand the testing aspect, and one of the games that's played is, before it was, oh yeah, third party tested. And now it's, third party tested, with ISO labs, because that's part of the Amazon requirements. But what people don't know is that ISO 17025, which is the lab standard, it only applies to certain methods within that lab. So a lab will say we're ISO, but then you send your sample for a test and they're running a method that's not ISO, that's not validated. And so what I've advised people is, okay, on the lab report, it has to say not only ISO, but the method that is ISO certified. And even from there, just because it's ISO certified doesn't mean it's foolproof. Just like any auditor, they come in one day a year and look at a cross section of your data. Well, they might not be looking at whether the greens powder it's validated for the greens powder, because every matrix or every product or ingredient we have might interfere with the test in a different way. And no lab has verified in matrix for everything that they test. So it might be validated for vitamin C, but it's not validated for greens powder. And so, we see that in micro testing where turmeric or things that are antimicrobial themselves, well, they'll kill off the pathogen that's actually in the product in the test. So it registers as negative while the pathogen is still in the product. So until you've validated and done the spiking and a positive control and all this stuff, well, there is a certain part of this that is very opaque, from a lab point of view. And that's where the experience comes in of, okay, having somebody who's a, analytical testing background who knows what validation is supposed to look like. And, because, we have this saying, quality control. Nobody knows what we do until we don't do it. Right. And so nobody knows about this stuff until something happens. And then you go back, you're like, oh, the test result was wrong. But, so prevention, ounce of prevention is worth a ton of cure, basically, in some cases.
Man, so we've talked about a spectrum of things of where the process can break down in supplements. As a consumer, what can a consumer do, to kind of protect themselves, or what should they take away from this conversation to know when they're going to go buy their next product? Like, how do I do the best I can to confirm that this is a quality product I'm buying?
Yeah, I could write a book on that because there's so much to it. But, we can sit there for a half an hour every night and figure out what's for dinner, or go on Yelp and figure out, okay, who are we, so it's like there is time required, and there's not necessarily an easy answer. But yeah, certainly educating yourself about the tricks and the games people can play, and what a good label is supposed to look like, what a compliant label is supposed to look like, even down to, okay, is the thickness of the hairline, does that look about right? Because there's established companies, Now Foods comes to mind, these people have been around for years. Well, they have, a team of attorneys and a team of quality people and everything. And so if you follow, what they're doing, well, you can't go wrong, because you have, this huge team of professionals behind this product. Whereas, some of the newer brands, well, they're startups, or they're younger than 10 years old. And so they haven't gone through the growing pains that the larger brands have done. And so if I have a litmus test myself, it is that I buy from these, large established brands. And then I also tend to buy more expensive products because I know that, you often pay for what you get, and there's, essentially there's no deals, in this world, and so, even down to, looking at unit cost and what cost per capsule and comparing cost per capsule of the same dosage to other brands, you're like, oh, now you can kind of see, okay, who's cheaper? How are they doing that? Are they, and so, single vitamins, you buy a vitamin C product, well, that's pretty cheap to make. But, it's hard to make a good multivitamin for cheap. And so when I see multivitamins for $20, that brings pause. And so, there are certain litmus tests, but certainly, overblown claims, health claims that don't look like everybody else's health claims, where they're, pushing the edge, or health claims that, maybe seem too good to be true, or oftentimes companies will make health claims based on mechanism of action, and because they don't have clinicals, so they talk about, oh yeah, whatever biomarker or whatever, like, or overly vague claims. Everybody kind of goes back to these vanilla overly vague claims because they know that there's no enforcement. And so yeah, really digging in, and because you're investing in your health, number one, you're paying money, number two, and so it should be an exercise that where you spend at least as much time finding credible sources of information, educating yourself, as you do for, buying dinner or whatever the types of things you do for your health. Otherwise, exercise, everybody wants to spend 10 hours a week exercising, but then they want to find a supplement in 5 minutes. And that doesn't work.
I think that's great advice. Okay, Blake, last question for you to close. What is your top non-negotiable supplement that you personally rely on? And what is one supplement flying under the radar that you wish more people were talking about?
The one that I have, if I don't take anything else, it'll be a good multivitamin. And so I've always stuck to the Solgar V-Tabs. Because you look at the label, you're using the best ingredients, they're using the right dosages, they're not trying to fit it all into one capsule necessarily. It's a more expensive product, they're $40-50 sometimes. And so yeah, Solgar has never sacrificed their quality over years. They haven't gravitated towards this low cost kind of demand where everybody's going. And then, the one that I really like, and I'm actually a co-inventor on, so I should like it, is called PCQ. And it's a combination of palmitoyl ethanolamide with curcumin and quercetin. And this particular ratio is found to be better for inflammation in cells than any other combination or ratio. And so it ended up getting patented. But they really market it towards dogs because it really works in dogs really well. And there's some really great reviews, and it's one of the few formulations that's been clinically researched in dogs. And so you see, a lot of dog products are, you might have research on glucosamine, but not on the full formula. And so yeah, really painstaking, took 10 years to develop it, not like, it wasn't an overnight thing. But yeah, PCQ is probably my go-to. Every time I have a little ache or pain, instead of an NSAID or whatever, I'll pop one of those, and it works about the same.
Awesome. I love it. Blake, thank you so much for joining us in Science Corner. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely, Jordan. Great to be here and great to share.